floor for questions. Please place your questions in the question and answer section, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. This program is being translated in Rohingya and Burmese. Our thanks go to our two translators who have quite a task to complete. If you want to hear the translation, you can switch to the Rohingya or Burmese channel at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, Chairman Nurul Islam, the floor is yours.
Rohingya Bada Sakago Natanjin, Rohingya UP Naimaria, Yaku season Satin Babi, and get Nurul Islam go, a copy position, Jesus de Mare.
Thank you very much, Regina. Thank you, everyone.
Jesus de Mare, Regina, Gulu.
And first of all, I, as a chairman of the Arakan Rohingya National Organization, I thank every participant and the panelists. For your time. We have Professor and Dr. Habib Siddiqui.
Dr. Habib Siddiqui, Professor Michael
I am just a brief overview of the Rohingya history.
Rohingya Lunyo
To begin with, history is the matter of life and measure of its performance. It reflects human life in all passing phases. And evaluates its works through ages. Every country or every people has history. People past history, determining the pace of present progress and the shape of history. Rohingya are a predominantly Muslim community.
Rohingya
glorious past. Unfortunately, their history has remained totally neglected and not like many indigenous ethnic peoples living on Burma, their culture, distinct from the connection to the high cultures of the world, their sublime civilization was a gift to the whole people of the kingdom of Arakan. Arakan prospered in international trade. Ideas and learning, a flourishing civilization in modern for centuries. Arakan had civilizations, Hindu, Buddhist, and Islamic. In ancient times, Arakan was very much the ancient Arakanis were descended from Aryan. Rohingya of today are true embodiment of the ancient people of Arakan. But in medieval time, there was reorientation eastward. The area fell under pagan dominance, and the Arakanese people began to speak a dialect of Burmese, which continues to this day. People to travel to the east by sea. They were in contact with Arakan even during the pre-Islamic days. Before
Arakan data ကလည်းခေတ်ပြိုင်ထွန်းကားခဲ့တဲ့ data တစ်ခုဖြစ်ခဲ့ပါတယ်
1788 AD, some Hindu dynasty rules over the certain limited area of this region, along the capital along the river Lemu.
မှာမိမိတို့မှာ
In 788
Arakan
AD,
data မှာဆိုရင်
a new
1900 data မတိုင်ခင်ကတည်းက Hindu လူမျိုးစုတွေရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်ဒီတဲ့အခါမှာဆိုရင်ဗုဒ္ဓဘာသာဝင်တွေရောက်လာပါတယ်ပြီးတော့ဆိုရင်ဒီဌာနေတိုင်းရင်းသားတွေဖြစ်တဲ့ Hindu ဘာသာဝင်တွေကလည်းဗုဒ္ဓဘာသာဝင်ကိုကူးပြောင်းသွားပါတယ်ထိုနည်းတူစွာအချို့ကအစ္စလာမ်ဘာသာဝင်တွေဖြစ်လာခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
occurred over and over in the coast of Arakan and Chittagong.
အဲ့ဒီအပြင်ဒီ Arakan data နဲ့ Chittagong data နှစ်ခုကဆက်ဆက်မှုတွေရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်
The Muslim population in Arakan went down during the long period of 5 centuries following the conquest of the Easterly Hindu kingdom of Wetali by the Mongolian
လို့ခေါ်တဲ့ Hindu ဘုရင်နိုင်ငံကိုလည်းသိမ်းပိုက်နိုင်ခဲ့ပါတယ်
The Maung was the last dynasty of Arakan. It was built
ဆိုတာကတော့ Arakan ရဲ့နောက်ဆုံးဘုရင်နိုင်ငံတော်တစ်ခုဖြစ်ခဲ့ပါတယ်
reinstated to his throne by the king of Bengal with
အဲ့ဒီ
a
မှာဆိုရင် Bengal ကဘုရင်ကဖျက်ဆီးဖို့ကြိုးစားခဲ့ပါတယ်
Maung was the most glorious
ဆိုတာကတော့
his kings adopted the Muslim title like Pasha
ဥမာရှိတဲ့ဘုရင်တွေကအစ္စလာမ်ဘာသာဝင်တွေရဲ့ဘွဲအမိတွေကိုလည်းခံယူခဲ့ပါတယ်
and
ဒီအခါမှာဆိုရင်မိမိတို့ကဝန်ကိုမင်းဆက်တွေနဲ့လည်းလူဆက်ဆံမှုပြုလုပ်ခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
Kalama Islamic Declaration of Faith in Arabic script
ပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာဆိုရင်အဲ့ဒီမှာ Arakan data မှာဆိုရင်အာရဗီဘာသာစကားကိုလည်းရုံးသုံးဘာသာစကားအဖြစ်သုံးစွဲခဲ့ပါတယ်နန်းတွင်းတွေထဲမှာလည်းသုံးခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
During his days as an independent kingdom until 1784 Arakan encompassed
1984မတိုင်ခုနှစ်အထိ Arakan data က
in the southern part of today's Bangladesh
data ယခုဘင်္ဂလားဒေ့ရှ်နိုင်ငံတောင်ပိုင်းအထိဝင်ခဲ့ပါတယ် Arakan နဲ့ Chittagong data ကဆိုရင်ခွဲခြားလို့မရခဲ့ပါဘူး
cultural and historical considerations quite often Muslim contribution in Arakan was too great to the extent that began with the spread of the Muslim civilization there because of the political and commercial link between those two territories. Korean used to call Arakan extended Chittagong and Chittagong Greater Arakan.
ဒီတော့က Chittagong data နဲ့ Arakan data ကခွဲလို့မရပါဘူး
For a long time there was no political boundary between Arakan and Chittagong.
အချိန်ကြာအထိကို Arakan data နဲ့ Chittagong data က border တစ်ခုတည်းမှာရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်
Either Chittagong as an integral part of Arakan, Arakan as a federal state of Bengal for a considerable period of time.
Bengal ရဲ့ပြည်နယ်တစ်ခုဖြစ်ခဲ့ပါသေးတယ်
either in Chittagong or Arakan or double home in and citizenship in both provinces. This is true with the ethnic people living on all along the borders of Burma. Vast
နိုင်ငံတစ်ခုလုံးရဲ့ဒီ border area မှာနေထိုင်တဲ့သူတွေကဟိုဘက်ဒီဘက်ကူးဆက်ဆက်ပြီးတော့နေထိုင်ကြတယ်ဖြစ်ပါတယ် ရှိတော့မိမိတို့ပြည်မယ်လူမျိုးတွေရှိပါတယ်မွန်လူမျိုးတွေရှိပါတယ်မွန်လူမျိုးတွေကလည်းထိုင်းနိုင်ငံမှာနေကြပါတယ်အိန္ဒိယမှာနေလို့လည်းဗမာကြီးတို့ခေါ်တဲ့လူတွေကလည်းဘင်္ဂလားဒေ့ရှ်မှာနေကြပါတယ်မြန်မာမှာလည်းခွာပြီးနေကြပါတယ်အဲ့လိုမျိုးနေဆက်နေတဲ့ဆိုဟိုဘက်ဒီဘက်နိုင်ငံတွေမှာဆက်ပြီးတော့ဒီနိုင်ငံလူမျိုးစုတွေကမြန်မာနိုင်ငံလုံးမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
In the similar pattern, the Rohingya also inhabit
Rohingya တွေကလည်း Chittagong မှာလည်းနေထိုင်ပါတယ်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံရခိုင်ပြည်နယ်ယခုအခေါ်ရခိုင်ပြည်နယ်ရခိုင်အခေါ် Arakan data မှာလည်းနေထိုင်ခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
More people can be Rakhine in Burma and Bangladesh again the same Mok and Rakhine can be
ခေါ်တဲ့လူတွေကကြတော့ Yamanangama, Yakai Lumu, Kojabare, Bangladesh Maro, Turugo,
developed in Arakan from peoples of various ethnical backgrounds over the several stages be ethnic Rohingya after the name of Rohang, which is long been a historically popular name in the region. The word Rohingya means people of Arakan or Rohang. Due to political persecutions and occasional wars or forced expulsion of people, the influx of refugees from Arakan into Bengal and Chittagong has almost been intermittent phenomena continues till today. In 1784, a number of people from Arakan, both Thein and Rohingya, fled to Chittagong to escape massacre and persecution of the Burmese occupying forces. They assimilated in Bengal. For example, the Roy comprising nearly half of the population in southern Chittagong traced their to Arakan. Bangladesh. Despite this, Burmese and the ultra-nationalist Arakan claim that the Rohingyas are without providing any evidence in the strict sense, illegal immigration or such migration that may have from any parts of India to Burma was perfectly and no law by the Burmese government, not even the infamous 1982 Since 1942, program in Arakan, population from 1962 military rule by General Narrating. They have faced systematic into Bangladesh and other countries. Communities of non-Rohingya from impoverished Arakan are informally it would make very little sense for a Bangladesh in a more impoverished And the Burmese legislation, Section 3(1) of the Union amended as December 1968 states, for the purpose of the Constitution, the expression any of the indigenous races of Burma, Maung and Rakhine MPs, as has within the union as their permanent home from political consideration to a hybridized or mixed Council up to 2015.
မှာလည်းကျွန်တော်တို့တွေက
there was a cabinet
ရွေးကောက်ပွဲ
decision
မှာ
of them
လွတ်လပ်စွာဝေပြိုင်ခွင့်မရခဲ့ပါဘူး
in November 1947.
ပြီးတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့နိုဝင်ဘာ1948ခုနှစ်ကိုပြန်ကြည့်မယ်ဆိုရင်လည်း
Rohingya in a state of Arakanese Muslim.
ရိုဟင်ဂျာဒေသမှာရှိတဲ့ Arakanese Muslim တွေကိုရိုဟင်ဂျာလို့ခေါ်ပါသည်လို့ရေးသားထားချက်တွေရှိပါတယ်
Burma Broadcasting Service
ပြီးတော့
Rohingya News Program
Burma Broadcasting Service BBS လို့ခေါ်ခဲ့တဲ့တစ်ချိန်လုံးကအတန်လွင့်ဌာနရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီမှာရိုဟင်ဂျာဘာသာစကားကိုလွှင့်ထုတ်လွှင့်ခဲ့ပါတယ်တိုင်းရင်းသားဘာသာအစီအစဉ်အနေနဲ့အတိအမှတ်ပြုခဲ့ပါတယ်ဒါကလွတ်လပ်ရေးရပြီးတဲ့အချိန်ကာလတွေမှာကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုတိုင်းရင်းသားအဖြစ်အတိအမှတ်ပြုခဲ့တဲ့အချိန်ကာလတွေလည်းရှိခဲ့ပါသေးတယ်ခင်ဗျာ
supported the Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi with the hope that
Nobel ဆုရှင်ဒေါ်အောင်ဆန်းစုကြည်ခေတ်ရောက်ပြန်တော့
to expectation she did
ကျွန်တော်တို့ကအင်မတန်မှကိုမျှော်လင့်ချက်ကြီးကြီးထားခဲ့ကြပါတယ်တရားသဖြင့်တိုင်းပြည်ကိုအုပ်ချုပ်မယ်
mass deportation
လူတိုင်းအခွင့်အရေးတွေရမယ်လို့မျှော်လင့်ခဲ့ကြတော့ညာလဲ
military brutality
ဘာတွေဖြစ်ခဲ့လဲဆိုတော့စစ်တပ်ရဲ့ဒီကျွန်တော်တို့
she has failed to adhere to moral
ဆက်မှုတွေကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီမှာဒေါ်အောင်ဆန်းစုကြည်တို့ကရေငုံနှုတ်ပိတ်နှုတ်ဆက်နေခဲ့ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျာ
The ethnic Rohingyas have lost
အဲ့ဒီ
all
တော့ရိုဟင်ဂျာတိုင်းရင်းသားတွေကအခွင့်အရေးတွေဆုံးရှုံးခဲ့ပါတယ်မိမိတို့နေအိမ်တွေကနေမောင်းထုတ်ခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်အခြားဒေသကိုတွန်းပို့ခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်အစုလိုက်အပြုံလိုက်မောင်းထုတ်ခြင်းခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်ဒါအပြင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုကိုယ်အိမ်မှာနေတဲ့သူတွေကိုတခြားနေရာကနေခိုးဝင်လာတယ်လို့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုဆွဆွဲကြပါတယ်အဲ့ဒါက Nobel ဆုရှင်ဒေါ်အောင်ဆန်းစုကြည်ခေတ်မှာဖြစ်ခဲ့တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်နောက်ပြီးတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့တွေအစုလိုက်အပြုံလိုက်ဒီလိုတော့တစ်ပွဲကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ရင်ဆိုင်ခဲ့ရပါတယ်
However, it should be emphasized that the return to military rule is unacceptable.
အခုကျွန်တော်တို့က
Burma embraces
မြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာစစ်တပ်ရဲ့အာဏာသိမ်းမှုကိုပြန်လည်ခံလိုက်ရပါပြီ
regardless of race, ethnicity, and
အဲ့ဒီ
religion.
ကြောင့်ဘာဖြစ်လာလဲဆိုတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကအခုကအားလုံးရောပြွန်းပြီးတော့ဖိနှိပ်ညှဉ်းပန်းနှိပ်စက်မှုတွေကိုအတူတူခံစားနေရပါပြီ
The Rohingya have the right of
ဘယ်ဘာသာပဲကိုယ်ကွယ်ကွယ်ဘယ်လူမျိုးပဲဖြစ်ဖြစ်ကျွန်တော်တို့အားလုံးကအတူတူညှဉ်းပန်းနှိပ်စက်မှုကိုခံနေရပါပြီ
entitled to right of self-determination.
အဲ့ဒီအတွက်ကြောင့်မိမိတို့က
For the
အခုက
individual
အားလုံးကအတူတကွယုံထားရမယ်အချိန်ဖြစ်ပါပြီမိမိတို့ကကိုယ်ပိုင်ပြဋ္ဌာန်းခွင့်တွေကိုတောင်းဆိုရမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
and
ဆိုတော့အဲ့ဒီအချိန်မျိုးမှာဆိုရင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ရဲ့အခွင့်အရေးကိုလည်းကျွန်တော်တို့ကတောင်းဆိုပါတယ်ခင်ဗျတရားသဖြင့်နီးလန်းကနေကျွန်တော်တို့ကတောင်းဆိုပါတယ်
under the federal future federal
အဲ့ဒီ
union
တော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကမြန်မာနိုင်ငံကြီးကိုအနာဂတ်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံက Federal ခေတ်သစ်ပြည်ထောင်စုနိုင်ငံတော်အဖြစ်ရရှိရေးအတွက်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကစုမှုကောင်းတောင်းပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့လည်းတကယ်မျှော်လင့်ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျဒါမှဒါနဲ့တိုင်းပြည်ကြီးကလူမျိုးပေါင်းစုံဘာသာပေါင်းစုံတရားဝါပြောစွာနေထိုင်နိုင်တဲ့တိုင်းပြည်ကြီးဖြစ်နေမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
This is a fair, coherent.
ဒီလိုလုံးမသာလင်ကျွန်တော်တို့တွေက
Thank you for your listening. Thank you.
တိုင်းပြည်တိုးတက်မှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်အခုလိုမျိုးနားထောင်ပေးတာကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျာ
Chairman Nurul Islam, and to everyone who's experiencing sound issues, we'll continue to work on it. Just make sure that you have the channel that you want selected and click original audio off, and we will continue to improve it. In the meantime, I'm going to pass the floor on now to Professor Michael Charney. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thanks for inviting me today to give my thoughts on Rohingya history. I'm going to give some general impressions because the time isn't huge, and because I know that this is being translated for multiple audiences, and I want to be kind to the translators. Like all ethnic groups in Myanmar, the origins of the Rohingya identification or self-identity has murky origins. We do not have the details, never will, on exactly how the process of ethnic formation occurred in its earliest centuries. We know that we know that Islam there's a good chance Islam has been present in Rakhine at least since the 7th century. It would also appear that the main population base of Rakhine was for thousands of years shared with Bengal, and that Burman immigrants from the Irrawaddy Valley began to move across the Rakhine Yoma in the early modern period, perhaps as early as 11th century, and in larger numbers as part of the wars between Inwa and Bago in the early 15th century. Afterwards, more immigrants were attracted to a Muslim-Buddhist court in Rawu from the 1430s. We know almost nothing about Burmese-speaking Theravada Buddhists in Rakhine before this time. Burmese language literature has a poem, The Rakhine Myth Mie Jin, from the early 15th century, which actually is connected to an Upper Burma princess planted in Rakhine. Inscriptions before this time are mainly in Devanagari, not in Burmese script. There is no real history, just history, created later on perhaps from myths and legends, but certainly not any recorded facts. In other words, we have very little evidence on either Muslim or Theravada Buddhist Burmese speakers in Rakhine before the early 15th century. From that time, the Mrau court was part of the Bay of Bengal world, circulated literati, military elites, and religious teachers throughout the region, and adopted a syncretic court culture that provided welcome home to both Muslims and to Buddhists. The dual religious identity of the court cemented its control over heavily Muslim Chittagong in the north and heavily Theravada Buddhist Thandwe in the south from the late 15th century. Probably everyone in Rakhine saw themselves as politically Rakhine, in political affiliation to the Mrau court. My view is that the Rohingya owe the emergence of their ethnicity not as much from these sources as from the tens of thousands of captives who were raided from Bengal and resettled and intermarried with local Rakhine in the Galadan River area from the 16th and particularly from the 17th century. The raids on Bengal for these captives is well documented. Some were sold to the Dutch, others sent to the Rakhine court to serve as Mudan, royal service people. Many others, perhaps most, were sent to form villages in the Galadan River area, where they opened up rice fields and produced the rice that the court then sold to the Dutch in the 17th century. Again, well documented. What we do not have are the detailed records of each individual who was taken, not because these records did not exist, but because they were burned by the Dutch as part of a clearance of old records in the 19th century. Again, well documented. By the mid-18th century, the population of Rakhine was estimated to be of 75% Bengal origin, that is, descended from these captives. Although many over the years would have died from malaria and other endemic diseases of the region, and others would flee from the Burman conquest and harsh rule from 1785, when British rule was extended over Rakhine in the 1820s, there were still an estimated 25,000 descendants of these captives left in Rakhine, 1/4 of the overall population. Many more were likely living across the Naf River in the Chittagong area from the later 1780s. When Francis Buchanan interviewed Rohingya here, they referred to themselves by that name, Rohingya, and argued that they and not the Burman residents of Rakhine at the time were the natives of Rakhine. My own idea, my own theory is that when they referred to themselves as Rakhine, or from Rakhine, they used the Bengali word for Rakhine that they carried with them to the region from the 15th century. And this, plus being a person from this area, came to be the Rohingya that we have today. At that time, both Rohingya and Rakhine meant being a native of Rakhine, depending on which dialect of language one used, and one had the peculiar culture, the peculiar material culture of their community that they saw as being the genuine Rakhine culture. The big irony is that many of the detractors will say that the British did not record them as Rohingya, but as Arakan Muslims, which is the historical foundation of what Rohingya probably means for most. In actuality, they are Rakhine who would define their ethnicity around their Muslim culture and called this Rohingya. There were also a smaller number of Hindus who also called themselves Rohingya and defined their ethnicity around their Hindu culture. This is the way that ethnicity is formed. Under the Burman administration from 1785 and the British administration from the mid-1820s, the Burmese language version of the ethnic referent was the one which was recorded. The Burmese version of this was the one that was recorded in the records. Probably many who call themselves at home Rohingya and some were probably Buddhist as well as Muslim, were recorded as being Rakhine in the records. In fact, later in the 19th century, the British authorities would tell their census takers in Rakhine to avoid recording local versions of names for population groups and just sort out everybody according to the prefix template that they had already put together on the basis of the rest of Burma and India. Rohingya as a referent gets erased from the Burma records and the way data was compiled, so that anyone who looks Indian was suddenly labeled as a foreign migrant. The Rohingya get labeled Chittagonian or Bengali or Arakanese Muslims at different times, but as cultivators in rural areas outside of the mainstream of colonial Burma, this meant that they lacked agency in colonial data collection and the colonial construction of knowledge. This task was left instead in the hands of British officials and Burmese subordinates who wanted administrative simplicity. More importantly, Western Orientalism had constructed knowledge about Burma to pigeonhole it and legitimate rule. Buddhist Burmese were under British rule because Buddhism, the religion, kept them focused on religion and not on industry, and thus unproductive economically. The British praised Muslims in Rakhine as hardworking, clever agriculturalists. It benefited the British to argue that the native Burmese, including the Rakhine, were Buddhists, to claim that they were Buddhists because they then needed colonial guidance and management to make them economically productive. If the Rohingya, those Muslims speaking a dialect of Bengali, were the actual natives in parts of Rakhine, then British rule was actually unnecessary. Instead, if the Rohingya were depicted as foreign immigrants who came because of British rule and made the land productive, then this helped to legitimate the colonial project. Simplicity and legitimation of colonial rule through a colonization of knowledge about Burma meant that the Rohingya had to be forward in colonial era. As part of British India, which until 1937 included Burma, the Rohingya looked at both emerging political discourses on Pakistan and Burma. There were certainly advocates of each. The communal problems, though, seem to have really been brought out in Rakhine by the chaos of the Japanese invasion in 1942 and the separation of different parts of the region between the British and the Japanese lines for much of the war. The administrative and colonial approach to knowledge about Rohingya, as I mentioned earlier, continued into the post-colonial period and into the Cold War because it served the construction of area studies knowledge about the world by the U.S. It was easier to cut up the world into numerous monolingual national states that could be won over from the communists like gambling chips than to deal with the full complexities of each political unit as constructed under colonial rule. So for all those Americans and British, all those Americans and British who were studying Myanmar, it was a Buddhist, Burmese-speaking country. All of it, historically, going well into the origins of the historical past, as well as the present. The Burmans, who exerted hegemony over Myanmar in 1948, agreed, but it was really the military takeover in 1962 that saw the government stepping towards full-fledged paradigms that excluded the Rohingya and others. History was rewritten along nationalist lines that promoted the military's role in history and portrayed it as a savior of the nation. Republishings of the Chronicles saw the military require that these rewrite the names of ethnic groups according to new official versions. The National Museum put up depictions of all of Myanmar's peoples that the military recognized and left others out. The military then went on to claim that the oldest human beings anywhere in the world were discovered in Myanmar. My view is that the people who have become the Rohingya are historically Rakhine, as much or more than other groups living in Rakhine. Once we drop Orientalist, colonial, Cold War, and nationalist constructions of knowledge, we find that the Rohingya have emerged as an ethnic group in the same way as most other ethnic groups in the country. Many were refugees or transplanted war captives. Groups like the Karen spoke scores of dialects until missionaries clarified these down to two. Who were the Maung? Are they the same as the Raman, or as the groups who called themselves in the 19th century Abbasis? Or do we go to the Burmese word line, and do we accept their connection with European references to Pyidaungsu? Which group today is the Gui, who were settled in areas around Inwa actually, and in areas that the Kachin are today in the 18th century and early, are the Thet, the Chakma. European accounts of the 19th century claim that the Rakhine Buddhists did not call themselves Rakhine, but rather refer to themselves as Marama. Indeed, we even have Marma, Chantha, Tantha, all of whom claim or could be claimed to be Rakhine Buddhists. The main point I would assert is that when you go picking through ethnicities in Myanmar to learn their history, a lot of the groundwork for everyone was done in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Those who promote a Burman Buddhist identity as the natural state of the population of the country do not really understand that their identity too has undergone the same degree of invention, from heterogeneity to homogeneity, because they have been politically dominant for so long, before colonial rule and after colonial rule, and even held the position of the true native stock in the period in between. It is Burman records that have been preserved, Burmese language and Burmese versions of reference that are official, of ethnic reference that are official. Their histories, mythologies that are preserved and seen as legitimate. They are standard. They suffer from the same blindness that comes out from what Matthew Waltham has called Burman privilege. It is the same curse that has shaped the white privilege and colonial knowledge of the West. It is the same kind of pillar that, like that of Eurocentrism, needs to be toppled to move beyond the misimagined constructed world and see the world as it really is, or really should have been before the European conquest of the globe. So to come back to my initial proposition, how do we decolonize Rakhine history? As is the case with other ethnic races or minorities in Myanmar, this means rectifying the misconstructions of Oriental scholarship and neo-colonial scholarship. But it also means recognizing that in Myanmar, Burman constructions of knowledge work hand in hand with colonial authorities to produce a Myanmar that fit the Burman imaginary. The task at hand is also decolonizing the Burman imprint on knowledge about Myanmar and its peoples, its history, its culture, and its religion. It means holding Burmans to task and persuading them to recognize the Burman privilege they operate under on a daily basis at every level in the country. It also means restoring the wrongs done by Burman nationalism, particularly under the military dictatorship from 1962. How do we recover Rohingya history? We can look at the efforts of African Americans to recover their histories. Like those who have emerged as the Rohingya, they too were forced to come to America as slaves, to work as cultivators for the profit of others. They were not treated as equal and were blocked by white nationalists from full political equality. They were attacked from organized anti-black white organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and suffered lynchings. If we substitute Rohingya for African American and Burman for white, we see what a struggle the Rohingya faced in Myanmar even before 2017. In the U.S., African Americans were also denied to have a history other than that as a footnote in an overwhelmingly white national narrative. Currently, and unfortunately, there are some who are working heavily to try to disprove the Rohingya have a history in the country. This distasteful practice would be very much like trying to claim that African Americans were not American because they were brought to the country as slaves. That because the latter were not originally recognized by the U.S. Constitution as citizens, they do not deserve to be citizens today. If we are going to recover Rohingya history, we will have to use the decolonization toolkit and apply it to Myanmar's history with a view towards a more inclusive history that recognizes the authoritative historical texts and records of Myanmar's past are merely the narrow reflections of a particular and privileged proto-ethnic and religious view on the country's past, and not a genuinely objective record. We will need to make the profession of history in Myanmar and about Myanmar more ethnically and gender inclusive. Something we should have done. We should have actually done that today. We should have had a female Rohingya scholar as well, but maybe in the future. But I hope we will rectify this in the future. We will need to train Rohingya in a historical research method, fund historically reconstructive work on the Rohingya's past, and recognize that much of Rakhine's history is shared by the Rohingya, and not again the exclusive possession of one privileged ethnic and religious group in the region. We will need to recognize that all ethnicities in the country are equal parts historical and equal parts imaginary. All of them. We can only achieve this if we communicate with the Burman Buddhist historians on the need to eradicate bigotry in the Myanmar Academy. We will also need to question the very real existence of racism and Islamophobia in the Western Academy. That focuses on Myanmar and Theravada Buddhist studies. Now, my presentation has been shorter than 20 minutes, but I think that may, I'd like to pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charney. That was really enlightening, and thank you to Mr. Nurul Islam. That was really good too. So now, Dr. Siddiqui, the floor is yours, and I know that you have a presentation to share. So I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Regina. Can you